Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for your patience with us. We're going to go ahead and get started with our second Infrastructure Week webinar here at the Eno Center for Transportation. And today we're discussing the I-85 bridge rebuild in Atlanta with the Chief Engineer for the Georgia Department of Transportation, Meg Pirkle. Meg Pirkle manages engineering, construction, operations, and intermodal divisions at GDOT, among others. She has 30 years of experience under her belt and has established herself as a versatile professional with diverse experience, ranging from operations to program management to many other things. Today, Ms. Pirkle is joining us to discuss the GDOT response to a fire that devastated a major section of the I-85 corridor in the urban core of Atlanta. And they went through a speedy contracting and implementation project for that process with lots of interesting nuances that we will learn about today. We'll also be sure to have plenty of time for your questions at the end, so please do feel free to enter questions in the question box on the side of your screen at any time, and we will get to as many questions as possible after the presentation. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Meg.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad to join you all today to talk about the I-85 reconstruction project in the city of Atlanta. And let's see. I can get my slide to advance. There we go. Okay, thanks, David. Okay, so looking at the I-85 bridge collapse and rebuild, there were many aspects of this whole emergency situation and then the project following that really you could almost do a presentation on each of these topics and go in depth about our emergency response, the bridge design, the communications, the traffic operations response. And we have given presentations in depth on each of these topics. Since I assume this audience is a pretty broad and varied audience, I'm going to talk high level about each of these topics. And of course, if anyone has detailed questions or would like more information afterwards, I'll be happy to share. So this was the view from my daughter's lacrosse game on March 30th, 2017. And, I remember looking at the fire and thinking, gosh, what's going on over there? And then getting a phone call that it was a fire under one of our bridges. And then, not long after that first phone call, hearing that the bridge had collapsed. And for those of you who are not familiar with Atlanta, the tall buildings you see just beyond the smoke, that is not downtown. That is a northern business district called Buckhead. And so the main artery getting into the Buckhead business district, as well as downtown Atlanta, is Interstate 85. So around 6:30 p.m., the fire broke out underneath I-85 northbound. At this stretch of I-85, it's a long bridge viaduct. It goes over some rail yards as well as some state highways, and then there's Peachtree Creek just north of the area. So it's a very long bridge viaduct. And if you can see, this is the beginning of the fire, and there's a lot of plastic HDPE conduit that was stored under the bridge. This was property that belonged to Georgia DOT, and there was a fence around it with a sign that said, "No trespassing, property of Georgia DOT." And we don't really have all the information on who started the fire and why, but it quickly spread because there was a lot of material stored under the bridge. And this is the kind of plastic piping that you put fiber optic cable in when you're installing, for instance, an intelligent transportation system. So the fire grew very quickly. So it started at 6:30 p.m., but it was really looking like this, I'd say, within 15 to 20 minutes. It had really roared out of control. And it's interesting to note that our main intelligent transportation system fiber optic cable trunk line is attached to this bridge. So when this fire started, we lost connectivity to our ITS system, which provides all of the message signs and video to view what's going on the system. Luckily, it had been in place for over 20 years. We'd never had to use our redundant system. We'd never had to actually rely on that. But in this case, the redundancy did kick in, and we regained connectivity to our cameras and signs on the system. So here's a couple of pictures that just show the view from our cameras, from our 511 navigator system. And what you're looking at here, the 5 lanes in the middle of the photo, that is I-85 northbound. And then just to the right of the photo, there's a connector distributor roadway that we call the Buford Spring Connector. So this is evening rush hour in Atlanta. At this point, luckily, the traffic had been stopped and was not crossing the bridge. But, you know, as soon as we knew there was a fire under the bridge, our bridge inspectors had been summoned to turn around and come back to work and get to the bridge. So they were already en route. What you can see in the top right of this photo is actually the transit system for the city of Atlanta, MARTA. That is their rail switching yard. So this bridge is very close to a major transit system there as well. And you can see that the collector distributor is sort of lower than the interstate highway there. So I-85 also crosses a major state route in Atlanta. It's State Route 237 Piedmont Road, and that's the road where the fire trucks are parked here. And emergency personnel were immediately on hand, and the Georgia Highway Patrol had stopped the traffic. The City of Atlanta Police were on hand, as well as we have emergency response units that work for Georgia DOT. We call them our hero units. And of course, Atlanta Fire and Rescue, and they were battling this fire as best they could. And some of you may or may not be familiar with Atlanta. We're pretty well known for having some big traffic here. So you can see people hanging out on the bridge south of the fire, and traffic had been stopped for a while, and they're waiting to see if they're going to be able to get off this bridge anytime soon. I would say that the entire system was pretty much in gridlock. This section of I-85 carries about 243,000 cars a day. This is a major commute route to our northeastern suburbs. And it's also, you know, in Atlanta, we use our interstates almost as local roads. So it's also a major route just between Buckhead Business District and downtown. So after burning for 35 minutes, one of the bridge spans collapsed. It was a northbound span. And luckily, no one was injured in this event at all, thank goodness for the police. And really, literally, like 2 minutes before the collapse, the fire chief could hear the tensioning strands in the bridge starting to pop, and he immediately pulled back all the firemen, so no one was hurt at all when the bridge fell. And as soon as the bridge collapsed, at Georgia DOT, and probably at every DOT, there are some pretty routine things that we practice regularly for responding to emergencies. So immediately, all the folks who are on our Emergency Operations Committee started heading to our Emergency Operations Center to respond to this event. And we were met there by the Georgia State Patrol Commander, the Georgia Emergency Management Administration, the City of Atlanta had people there, as well as the Federal Highway Administration. So this is Thursday evening, about 7:30 p.m., and everyone starts rolling into the Emergency Operations Center. So the next few slides go through a timeline of our response. As you can see, the fire started about 6:30. About 45 minutes later, the bridge has collapsed, and we are all heading into work. Our state bridge engineer was actually having dinner with his son and brought his son to work because he had to leave immediately and head downtown. And we knew that no matter what happened with this fire, we were going to have to start inspecting that bridge as soon as we could. And so in anticipation of having to do it at night, we called a contractor who was working on an I-85 project widening about 20 miles north of here, and asked them to come down to the scene and bring light trucks so that we would have some lights to be able to inspect as soon as we could. We had design engineers who were pulling the bridge plans immediately, and we contacted the beam fabricator in the state of Georgia because there's really only one in the state of Georgia at Standard Concrete, and we knew that no matter what happens, you know, casting those beams was going to be, you know, the absolute critical path to getting this bridge rebuilt and back open. So we wanted to make sure they were aware of what was happening and that we were going to need their assistance in an emergency situation. For the next few hours, we were all on scene at the Emergency Operations Center. We were having hourly conference calls with our inspectors on the scene to get updates and find out what was going on. The FHWA division administrator who was with us at the Operations Center, he actually let us know, hey, you've got to get your governor to declare a state of emergency so that this project will qualify for federal emergency relief funds. So we did that. And we had their immediate approval to negotiate with a single contractor because we knew that this bridge collapse was going to cripple traffic in Atlanta, and it really did. So, so they were very much in support of us following what are already allowed procedures in emergency relief and federal highway to negotiate with a single contractor. At about 10:30 p.m., the contractor who had come with the light trucks called a demolition contractor, and they arrived on site because we knew that we would need to be able to get to work as soon as possible and show the public that we were making progress very quickly on this bridge. At 11 p.m., there was a joint press conference held at the scene of the fire, which was still burning at this point, quite largely, with the governor, the commissioner of DOT, Russell McMurray, the City of Atlanta Fire Police and Chief Police, FHWA, our Georgia Emergency Management Administration, and the State Patrol. And this was a very important press conference because it showed that we were all working together already. It was not about, you know, who owns this or who owns what or pointing fingers about who needed to do what. I mean, from 7:30 p.m. that evening, we were all in the room together and figuring out the way to solve this problem together. By 3 a.m. that night, we had an official detour in place and road closures in place. We had gotten the traffic turned around and off the bridges. And we had submitted an initial cost estimate to FHWA for the emergency relief funds. By Friday at dawn, the fire was finally cool enough for inspection to begin. So it burned overnight. Our inspectors slept in their trucks. And we actually, Georgia Power came out because there are huge power lines that go over this bridge. So they had tried to view the fire with a drone, but the heat was so much that the drone could not go low enough to actually view anything. So at dawn, as soon as first light came, we had inspectors get under there to see what they could see. And by 7 a.m. the next morning, demolition began. And actually, the demolition contractor had to do a little demolition just so that the fire department could put out the fire, because some of the material that was burning under the collapsed span was still burning, and they couldn't get to it to put that fire out until they were able to demolish some of the span. By Friday at noon, Secretary Chow had sent representatives to meet with our governor and our commissioner here in Atlanta, and they committed federal participation in rebuilding this bridge. And by 5 p.m. that day, we had authorization for $10 million of federal ER funds. And I don't know if anyone on the line has ever had to apply for ER funds, but usually you receive those funds about 2 or 3 years after you've finished your hurricane cleanup or your tornado cleanup. So the fact that we got them that day, this was very early in the new administration, and they wanted to show that they were in this and ready to participate. By 9 p.m. that night, our bridge design office had transmitted plans for 61 beams, bridge beams, to the beam fabricator and to the contractor. And GDOT was reviewing shop drawings for those beams by Sunday. I mean, it was almost like this operated as a design build project where our in-house bridge design team was the designer, and then of course the builder was the contractor we had called the night before. So over the weekend, design plans were finalized and the demolition continued and construction commenced early the next week. And we were also contacted by the National Transportation Safety Board and notified that they were going to do an investigation into the fire, and we joined in as cooperating agency in that investigation. So to give you some context about where we are in Atlanta, the star on this picture is downtown where the state capitol is, and the red fire is where the fire was on I-85. and most people have been through the Atlanta airport at some point, so you can see the airport to the southwest of downtown. Here's an aerial view of the bridge section that was impacted. You can see the transit rail switching yard just north of I-85, and then it's pointing to this roadway section that was affected by the fire. So this is what was damaged. The yellow square here is the span that actually collapsed and fell from the fire. And the blue spans around it were also damaged by the fire and had to be removed. So following our inspection, we were able to determine that this much bridge would have to be replaced. And it's almost like the Buford Spring connector provided a bank from the fire to the south, and the fire seemed to be drawn towards Piedmont Road, which is State Route 237. But it was evident by, I'd say by about 10 o'clock Friday morning, the day after the fire started, that we were going to have to replace 6 spans of this bridge. And if you notice on this picture, several of the spans are trapezoidal in shape, and the road is also in a super elevation at this point in the bridge, so it's unfortunately, it's not just a bunch of flat square spans. It's a little more challenging. And for the trapezoidal spans, every beam is a different length. So that means many, many different beams to design. So our inspectors, after they spent the night in our trucks, they had to actually use some wash off the bridges so that they could actually see to inspect. It took a while for everything to get cool enough to actually get in there and look. But they used hammers to sound the concrete, and they found serious delamination and spalling of the concrete beams, the columns, and the caps in the 5 adjacent spans. So we knew immediately that we were going to have a lot to work on. So demolition commenced the next day, and it was with a contractor called D.H. Griffin out of South Carolina. They actually happened to be in town because they were demolishing an old GM plant north of Atlanta. So luckily they had this equipment very close by. And we immediately contacted a consultant firm in Georgia. It's Moreland Altabelli, and they committed to doing this construction engineering and inspection for the rebuild of this project. And we also contacted the contractor who did the work for us was C.W. Matthews. So during the demolition, Moreland Altabelli, the CE&I consultant, kept track of the labor and materials and equipment because the demolition was done under force account. So you can see some of the equipment they were putting to use here. They used pneumatic crushers to literally chew away the bridge. And these machines, this process, separates the steel and the concrete concurrently. So it was all hauled away in dump trucks. And within a week, the site was completely clean of debris, and they worked 24/7 on demolition. The inspectors were on site during demolition to make sure that elements of the adjacent spans that were to remain in place were not damaged. So this demolition shows that some of the damage was to the columns and the caps, but you can notice that the beam support did not fall. It was the beams themselves that collapsed. The extreme heat caused the tensioning strands in the massive pre-stressed beams to relax, and thus they failed and collapsed. And just so you know, this bridge, it was actually built in, I think, 1984 or 85. It was a good, strong bridge. It was in good condition. So it's not like this was an old bridge that had already been compromised in any way. This was a good, strong bridge. You can see from this picture the rebar being exposed on the columns, and the column reinforcement appears to be buckling. So our bridge design team had to make really quick decisions about what could be recovered out on the site and reincorporated into the new design, or if it all had to come out. But we ended up keeping a part of the columns, and I'll show you some of that in the upcoming slides. And you can see here where the concrete on the columns and the beams had delaminated. Just a couple more pictures of demolition. And this is one of those giant pneumatic crushers. They looked like little alien monsters. So, and of course, the demolition continued 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And yes, there is an apartment building right next to this bridge. So we didn't make all friends, but in this speedy repair of this bridge, there were some people who were really unhappy. But it was really important to get this done quickly. And they had a lot of equipment put to work. And so the demolition progressed so quickly because they had so much equipment out there getting it done. One of the critical things they had to do was remove the bridge spans that are over State Route 237 Piedmont Road. And so you can see here the contractor placed timbers over the roadway for protection as the beams above it were removed, because we knew that at least we needed to get Piedmont Road reopened, even though I-85 was going to be shut down for a while. So those initial few days where Piedmont Road was shut down and I-85, you really just, it was really hard to get across town without going way, way, way out of your way. So with the span removed, Piedmont eastbound could be fully opened, and then the 2 lanes westbound could be open a couple days later. So this sort of starts where we really had to look at how are we going to keep moving traffic through and around Atlanta and to the Buckhead Business District, and even to the businesses surrounding this collapse. And so our state traffic operations engineer worked very closely with his team and with the city of Atlanta to look at, you know, roads that needed to be restriped and how to best get traffic off of the interstate. We actually changed the direction of a couple of one-way streets. We put a lot of things in place to try to make sure that the traffic could still move around and do what we could from a traffic operations perspective to increase throughput. And this is the removal of the span over Piedmont Road. So the official detours for this collapse, we do have a perimeter interstate around Atlanta, the Interstate 285. So the official detour was to take the perimeter around Atlanta. This probably added about 20 miles to someone's trip. And then the local detour, which was mostly on city streets in the city of Atlanta, is shown on the right side of the screen here. And it's worth mentioning that there are a lot of neighborhoods around this collapse, and really for the 6 weeks that this bridge was closed, garbage service almost came to a standstill. Mail service couldn't happen during the day because there was so much traffic cutting through all these neighborhoods that they all became like little mini freeways. I mean, when you have 243,000 cars that are trying to find a way to get through, it really made life hard on some of these surrounding neighborhoods. And the city of Atlanta worked with Waze and Google to try to say, you know, please don't route cars through these neighborhoods, because they just couldn't get through. And the city of Atlanta approved overnight garbage pickup so that the garbage trucks could run at night to get their work done. And if you look at these roads, you know, Cheshire Bridge Road, which is shown in the right side, that's a roadway with 18,000 vehicles per day. Peachtree Road in Atlanta has about 39,000 vehicles per day. And these surrounding roads, they saw an increase of almost anywhere from 40% to 100% increase in traffic during the time when this I-85 was closed. This map sort of shows the hot spots of where traffic really increased in Atlanta. The star shows where the collapse occurred, and you can see by the heat map that there was a big increase in traffic congestion in the areas north and south of the collapse. So part of our traffic operations response, of course, in the emergency situation, we kept the cameras trained on the fire, we had our heroes dispatched, and we started pushing information out through our 511 system. But long term, we really had to keep motorists informed via message signs and social media. We reported traffic shifts daily as things were able to close and open. And we participated in a lot of operational discussions with the city of Atlanta. We immediately upgraded 13 traffic signals in the area. We added 6 additional miles of active signal management. We funded a lot of painting. We went out and did Don't Block the Box because there was so much gridlock that people would just sit in the middle of the intersections. And the police department for Atlanta really enforced Don't Block the Box with tickets, and that was a big help. But one thing we had to do is we halted all lane closure permits in the city of Atlanta, and this is just be for buildings or any other utility repairs or other projects, because we just couldn't afford to have lanes closed anywhere in the vicinity of this detour. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the bridge design aspect of this project. So sequential to the demolition, bridge design began working Thursday night and immediately started looking at what were their options for design. Because of the complicated trapezoidal spans, they had to make a decision, could they use the original bridge design or did they need to redesign this bridge? So the original bridge was designed using AASHTO Type 5 pre-stressed concrete beams. And there really are no forms left at the concrete, supplier, at the concrete casting suppliers for that type of beam anymore. So we knew that if we were to go with the original bridge design, it would be a long time getting those beams fabricated and to the site. So they instead decided to change to a more commonly used beam that we have now, the 63-inch bulb T beam, because there are many forms available, and so we would be able to get the bridge beams cast much more quickly. But this required a complete redesign of the 6 spans of the bridge. But in their talks with the, with the contractor that makes these beams, that was decided that really, if we wanted to get this bridge open quickly, that was the only way to go. So they redesigned the beams, and as I said, because of the trapezoidal shape of the spans, they had to redesign a lot of individual beams, up 61 beams. But luckily, our contractor and the beam supplier were very much in the boat with us, and they both worked 24/7 to cast these beams. It also meant our lab had to be ready 24/7 to inspect these beams. So there were a lot of people working around the clock to make this project happen. We were able to retrofit some of the columns that were under the bridge, because you could see where the concrete had really delaminated around the columns. However, the foundations were still in good shape, so I'll show you some pictures later that show how we retrofitted the columns for the new bridge design. And this is our bridge design office working hard that Friday night. So 4 days later, we held a press conference at GDOT, and if you want to know who I am, I'm the only chick on the screen. But it was with our construction director, our commissioner, Russell McMurray, he's the one in the center, and then our traffic engineer, Andrew Heath. We were getting just bombarded with questions from the press and nationally from the press about what had happened, about the fact that, we did own the material under the bridge that caught fire, and so we needed to accept responsibility for that. And our communications team was just absolutely swamped. So we said we need to have a press conference and try to address everything and answer questions right up front. So our construction director, he talked about the plan for rebuild. I talked about the redesign. Our commissioner talked about the material under the bridge. And then our traffic engineer, Andrew Heath, talked about the detours and what we were going to do to try to manage traffic in the meantime. But really, the communications effort on this project was huge, and it continued for the next 6 weeks, where we had weekly press conferences out on the job, and our social media following increased, 100-fold, because really this just had Atlanta paralyzed, and everyone was waiting for information about this bridge. We also had a lot of transit partners with us. In Metro Atlanta, the biggest transit provider, of course, is MARTA, but the northeastern suburb that uses this corridor a lot is the Gwinnett County, and they also have transit system. And then the state runs express bus. We also have a program called Commute Options that pays people $5 a day to try new commute options. So that really got a lot of press during this event. So Express Bus started running shuttles to MARTA stations. We had people who had never ridden transit before taking transit for the first time. So MARTA had people at stations training people how to get on the train and how to pay for the card and everything. And they had to actually rent some parking to provide more parking at the stations. So let's talk a little bit about the construction contract. As you know, we selected a contractor the night of the fire and determined immediately that we were going to negotiate price with one contractor. So for the demolition, it was a force account. We kept track of all their hours and materials and equipment and then paid them straight up price for the demolition. When it came time for the construction contract, our bridge design team finished design on Sunday night after the Thursday fire. And then, so it's almost like we had a whole set of plans. We gave that to the contractor, and they developed a price, we developed a price, and then we got in the room and negotiated. And we did catch a little bit of flack because we have many contractors who are capable of building this bridge in the city of Atlanta. And so a lot of people were like, why didn't you put it out for bids? The reason why we didn't is because we knew we had to get those beams, the beam fabrication started immediately. So on Friday night, we had transmitted the beam plans to the contractor, and they had ordered 61 concrete beams. So even though we negotiated the final construction price about a week later, the contractor started work much earlier than that on the actual bridge replacement. So FHWA was also on board with us adding incentives for approval. You can see here how we structured those incentives. And the original completion date was announced as June 15th. And when we estimated that completion date, we were expecting about 16 hours a day of work and a normal amount of rain days in the city of Atlanta. So what we ended up getting was actually 24/7 hours of work because the contractor was very incentivized by that maximum $3 million bonus. And weirdly enough, we had half a day of rain in that whole 6-week period. So they had perfect weather for construction for 6 weeks. And so here you can see where the rebuild has started. The demolition is wrapping up, and they are starting to get equipment in there to rebuild the bridge. We also have a time-lapse video of this bridge reconstruction. If anyone's interested, you can view it on the GDOT website. Here you can see where they had to do handwork to remove the damaged concrete from the columns. This was pretty time-consuming, but since it allowed them to retain the inner core and the foundation of the column, it was worth it. And here's where they're finishing removing that outer damaged concrete to expose the steel. And that's what it looks like before they pour the new columns. So you can see here in the middle, those cages, those are larger round cages for the columns that they then set down over the existing columns. This is a picture of one of the giant beams that was coming to be delivered on the site. And I can tell you that when these, normally we would not allow these kind of oversized loads to go through during rush hour or anything like that. In this case, these beams were delivered as soon as they were ready, and there were literally people on the interstate cheering them as they went by because they were so excited to see the progress happening. And we had Georgia State Patrol. They escorted all of these beams to the site from the plant. For some reason, my slides quit forwarding. There we go. Okay. So this is about 5 days later. We have some of the bents are poured, are ready for cap pours, and columns are also getting poured as well. You can see they're wrapped, and progress is happening on construction. The contractor built a haul road that was stabilized with some asphalt millings, and they are preparing to bring in an 800-ton crane. And really, this was a strategic decision on the part of the contractor because they didn't have to have that big of a crane, but because they chose to pay a little extra for that big crane, they could place all of the beams without ever moving the crane. And so it definitely saved them time and got them closer to that incentive. As you can see here, there are some really big power lines that stretch over the bridge. So the contractor really had to plan their work and plan around, you know, that high tension power line so that there was no disruption there. And I give credit to the contractor because they were working 24/7 to get this bridge done as quickly as possible. They literally had a plan for each hour of work, and they knew what was going to be accomplished all along the way. They really executed well. The incentives really drove the schedule. So we knew pretty early on that they were on track to finish early, but due to the uncertainty of weather, and you know, if one of these beams had cracked or gotten damaged, it could have delayed the project another couple of weeks. So we didn't make any announcements about how far ahead they appeared to be until we were getting really close to the finish line. So the first beams were put in place, and you can see here where they're placing the beams with the crane, right next to the power line. So we use steel diaphragms on the bridges instead of concrete diaphragms, really just to save time. And we've used these before on bridges in Atlanta. And even though we typically use concrete, we know that the contractor really appreciated the use of the steel diaphragms here. So starting April 14th, this is about 2 weeks after the bridge collapse. You can see the construction really starting to take shape. And I'll just walk through the next couple of weeks. A week later, you can see that all the beams northbound are pretty much in place. And then a week later, beams southbound and northbound. And then you can see that the contractor is running out of open space to work now that he's got the beams in place and he's starting to get ready for the deck pours. This is a very tight construction area because there are roadways and development all around it. Here they're preparing for the deck pour. Here you can see the final deck pour is in place. And finally, May 13th, 6 weeks later, the bridge is open. So, as you can see, this happened pretty quickly. And this is just some numbers: 13 columns, 61 beams, 4 caps. We did have a ceremonial ribbon cutting after the bridge was open. We held it under the bridge, and Secretary Elaine Chao did attend that with us, just to celebrate, you know, getting this done quickly and successfully. So I am happy to take any questions. We do have some. I would just like to say that quick decisions are really key in a situation like this. You know, the decision to go with a contractor immediately, to put incentives in the contract, those are things that were all decided very early on. And then some lessons learned. We needed some signal contractors on call for emergencies. We've since put that in place. And in a situation like this, you don't have time to, you know, wonder about what to do. You have to escalate issues quickly. So, all right, I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Meg. That was super informative, and I was in Atlanta doing transportation at the time, and a lot of that is new information for me as well. We do have a bunch of questions coming in, and just as a reminder to everybody on the line, there is a question box on the side of your screen. Feel free to continue to enter your questions through there. The first question is one that we've gotten from a few people who have different circumstances, but looking for a similar outcome in what you mentioned, that you were trying to work with Google to reroute traffic so that it wasn't necessarily going through certain neighborhood areas. And this is something that, regardless of why, whether it's a bridge collapse or something else, agencies have wondered about. can you talk a little bit more about that process and what you were and were not able to accomplish out of it?
Well, it's interesting because it was more between the city of Atlanta and those entities. It started out with, I'm not sure if it was the city or something else, but initially there were like almost something entered into the system that blocked traffic into the local roads. But then I think commuters immediately realized, hey, this says I can't go this way, but I can. So then there was some backlash and anger about the fact that, that those systems were blocking some of the routes. So it was kind of a back and forth. I don't know if any of it I would call really successful, because when people are desperate, it's almost like a tidal wave. It's going to find a way to get where it's going. But it certainly wasn't controversy. So
very interesting. This is the first time I've heard of one of those routing algorithms actually doing that. So it's really interesting to see. We also had a couple of questions coming in asking more about the federal process working for that emergency response. And is it correct on your timeline that you guys actually filed for the budget before you had been able to fully inspect the area? And can you just talk a little bit more about that timeline and that process working with the federal government for funds?
Sure. So the process we followed is the standard emergency response process that's in federal guidelines now. And we knew that we made an assumption about how much of the bridge was going to be damaged. And we just luckily assumed, if one span fell, probably every span around it is going to be damaged, which is how it worked out. So we made an assumption about, demolition and rebuilding the bridge. And I think our initial estimate was probably about $20 million. And our actual costs at the end of the day were about $16 million. So it came in under what we had originally estimated. But it was a very high level estimate just based on what we know about rebuilding bridges. It was not based on any site inspection at all. It was just assuming we have to build this much and we've got to tear it all out. What do we think it's going to cost? And we submitted that to FHWA, at 3 a.m. the night of the fire.
Looking at that timeline is just amazing. How much you got done so quickly.
Things were happening quickly.
You mentioned that having the incentive structure really made a big difference in the project delivery timeline. Do you have any idea of how long it might have taken and what the cost difference might have been if that hadn't been a part of the contract?
Well, I think, our maximum incentive was about $3 million, and that was on the reconstruction contract, which I think our negotiated price was about $11.9 million. Here, let me look back here. So, they would have definitely been able to get it done by June 15th, which was our contract completion date. And if that's the case, it would have cost us $3 million less. And then we had, the staged incentive in between, where if it was a few weeks earlier, they got $1 million. A few weeks earlier than that, they got $2 million. So, but it was definitely worth it, because looking at the user costs and the impact to the users of this corridor, the actual user cost is about $800,000 per day. And that's just using the straight up federal highway formula that they provide everyone for that kind of calculation. And that doesn't even include the loss to businesses around and, the impact to people not being able to get through town at all. So it was definitely worth it. Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, we are just a couple minutes over now, and I know we started just a couple minutes over as well. Just a quick question also, Meg. Would it be possible for us to share these slides online with the viewers?
Absolutely.
Great. So we will... I'm sorry?
I was just going to say my contact information is there. If anyone has questions or follow-up, feel free to get in touch.
Excellent. And we'll put these up online. Everybody who registered should be able to, or even didn't register, should be able to go to that link. And we are definitely going to find the GDOT link to that time-lapse video also.
Okay.
Because it's really cool. So thank you so much for joining us. This has been really interesting. And also to all of our listeners, I want to remind you that our next webinar is going to be Tuesday, May 21st at 4 p.m. And that will be about regulation of bikes, e-bikes, and scooters. You can register online at our website, enotrans.org, where you can also find videos of past webinars and subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Eno Transportation Weekly. So thank you again so much, Meg, for joining us, and thank you to all of our listeners for taking the time to join us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
You too.